we make a deal with Canada?
I think it's really complex. They have been basically feeding off of us for decades upon decades upon decades.
They point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
I think India is going to be at the table, and they're going to say they're sorry, and they're going to try to make a deal with Donald Trump.
Howard Lutnick on Friday called out India for trying to make money of misery and derogatively said, oh, it will come back to the table like Canada did. That is exactly where lies the issue with the Trump administration's understanding of geography, relationships, and geopolitics. Let's be real. India is not Canada and is unlikely to ever react the same. And that is the difference between a country which was born inside the system and a country born fighting it. Why does he say that? Because earlier this year, Canada had pushed back aggressively against United States tariffs by imposing retaliatory duties of its own, including a planned digital services tax which targeted American tech companies. Now, this triggered threats of steep US tariffs in response. Trump hit Canada hard due to Canadian retaliation and imposed 35% tariffs on the country. But Canada's in a bad shape. It has mounting economic pressure with slowing GDP and rising unemployment. Its GDP growth shrank 1.6% in the second quarter, and its unemployment rate jumped to a 9-year high at 7.1%. Well, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney decided to withdraw the digital services tax, a move that was widely seen as a concession to restart the stalled trade talks between the two countries. In August, he also announced that his government would remove some of those retaliatory tariffs they had imposed. Oh, and remember, when at the start of the year, Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister at the time, went crawling to see Trump at the Mar-a-Lago resort, showing his desperation as Trump continued to kick him in the teeth. Now that's what Lutnick means when he says Canada will come back to the table. After an initial hard stance, they were prompted by that economic fallout to come to their senses, as Lutnick would see it. And that's what he thinks India will do.
In a month or 2 months, I think India is going to be at the table, and they're going to say they're sorry, and they're going to try to make a deal with Donald Trump.
Today, we're breaking down why Lutnick is wrong, why comparing India and Canada is like comparing fire to ice, and why India's path is one that Washington is still failing to understand. India is not Canada, and the sooner DC people realize that, the easier their work becomes. Let's dive in deeper. Watch till the end to understand why history, economics, alliances, and leadership all play their role to ensure that India reacts at US moves in a totally different way to Canada. And stay to the end to see why maybe Modi is not just so different from Justin Trudeau after all. Let's start with history, because history helps to explain a lot. Canada and India were both part of the British Empire. True. But what that meant could not have been more different. Canada was a settler colony. The British didn't just rule Canada, they lived, and their people became what we know as Canada today. They built its institutions, its laws, its economy. Over time, Canada wasn't conquered territory, it was family. By the 20th century, Canada became a dominion, a self-governing country, but still loyal to the crown. To this day, King Charles III is still the nominal head of state of the country. Canada's rise was aligned with the empire and later with the United States. India is a completely different story. India was colonized, plundered, stripped of its wealth. India's share of the global GDP was roughly around 23–24% at the time when the East India Company landed in the country. And by the time the Brits left India, it only had around 3–4% of the global GDP. Its independence wasn't granted. It was fought for through blood, struggle, and mass movements. Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, they all built a nation that had to claw its way out of foreign domination. So in essence, Canada's grown up inside the system. India's grown up fighting it. And when push comes to shove, that history shows up. Canada bends because it always belonged to the system. India resists because it never did. Canada, with its now 41 million people, mostly a product of the last 2 centuries, India with its 1.4 billion people with thousands of years of history. Now to economics. The numbers don't lie. Canada's trade is essentially one way. Over 75% of its exports go to the United States. Over $128 billion of energy products alone. Lumber, cars, agriculture also, all tied to one buyer. If Washington sneezes, Ottawa gets pneumonia. Its next largest export market is China, with only 3.9% of exports going there. And then comes the United Kingdom, with around 3.8%. This is why Carney himself, realizing the dependence on the United States, said during his victory speech after the election,
"Our old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increasing integration, is over. The system of open global trade anchored by the United States, a system that Canada has relied on since the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped deliver prosperity for a country for decades, is over."
Our old relationship with the United States, a relationship based on steadily increasing integration, is over.
Now looking at India, India's trade is very diversified as compared to Canada. The United States and China tie between being the first and second trade partners for the last couple of years. They take around 20% each. China's lost its top position after India pulled back trading with China after the 2020 Galwan Valley skirmishes between the two countries. However, looking at the chart shows how diversified India's trade actually is. If the United States and China are trades around $130 billion each, then it's also done over $100 billion trade with the UAE. Similarly, Russia and Saudi Arabia are important. Europe is also a big market for the country, and currently they're in negotiations for a free trade agreement. And that is expected to be signed by December. Thanks to Donald Trump, he's giving the talks a fresh impetus to conclude. Now, this explains why, when the US squeezes Canada, Canada ends up folding. But the same tactics don't work with India. When the United States squeezes India, India finds other doors open. Russian crude oil, UAE free trade, African partnerships, and now new incentive to improve relations with China. During the 3 months, April to July of this year, India's exports to China rose by 20% to around $6 billion, while imports increased around 13% to $40 billion. Then you've got increasing trade within the BRICS and the SEO blocks as well. Dependency, on the other hand, makes Canada predictable, but diversification is allowing India to be resilient. However, while Trump has not focused on service exports, India sells these in massive amounts to the United States, especially when it comes to IT services in particular. And that could become a pain point if the administration decided to lean into that, as many of its MAGA supporters are calling for. Even in energy, for example, the split is clear. Canada's oil and gas flow all go almost entirely to the south, pipelines that are dictated by the United States politics. India, though, is dependent on imports and is refusing US dictates about buying Russian crude oil. It buys its LNG from Qatar, renewables from the UAE, and nuclear reactors from France. Canada's energy feeds America. India's energy policy defies America, which is exactly what is riling the United States right now.
Because the road to peace runs in part through New Delhi. I mean, that's a lot of money.
Canada accepts alignment within the United States framework, whereas India insists on autonomy. But this is not just about trade. Canada's dollar lives in the shadow of the United States dollar. Its financial system is tied to Wall Street. By comparison, India guards the rupee like sovereignty itself. It rejects US sanctions when they go against its interests. Witness its continued economic relations both with Iran and Russia, despite US pressures. And now it's experimenting with the rupee settlements in global trade. It struck deals with energy imports with Russia to tea exports to Sri Lanka. And recently, its central bank has allowed the creation of special accounts that allow banks to settle international trade in Indian rupees and not be forced to use dollars as an intermediary. Now, that move was called by some to be a small step towards India removing itself from its dollar risk or de-dollarization. But when the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, was asked by the prominent finance anchor Maria Bartiromo on Fox News his thoughts on the rupee, he laughed at the idea, which creates another pinprick of insult for the Indian policymakers. Now, they weren't even thinking about de-dollarization necessarily in that way, or for the Indian rupee to become other central banks' reserves, foreign reserves. But it definitely doesn't make it better when someone else mocks you, that you don't even have a chance, even if you wanted to.
Do you worry that India is going to set trade in the rupee and they'll do trade with the rupee currency with the BRIC nations instead of the U.S. dollar?
There are a lot of things I worry about. The rupee becoming a reserve currency isn't one of them.
Then let's look at the alliances. Canada belongs to America's clubs, NATO, G7, Five Eyes. Every major alliance that Canada is in, the United States is in too. And it's in none of those that the United States is not in. India's different. India's in BRICS. It's in the SCO. It speaks for the global south. It stands with the global south. At the same time, it's sitting in the Quad with the United States, Japan, and Australia. It's trying to balance that east and west, especially since 2014, under Narendra Modi, India became much closer to the US than it has been historically. And the same contrast you can see in security. Canada's defense is outsourced. NORAD, which is the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NATO, the United States nuclear umbrella. Ottawa never needed to spend much on defense because Washington guarantees its safety. So much so that Donald Trump has accused the country of being a military free rider and asked it for payment if it wants to be part of the Iron Dome system, or the Golden Dome system, as he likes to call it. India, on the other hand, is surrounded by rivals, whether it's China or Pakistan. It has these volatile borders, has no such luxury. It has one of the world's largest standing armies, nuclear weapons, missiles, a growing navy, and now space capabilities. And despite all the recent security relationships with the United States, it's basically an independent nation when it comes to military security. Now contrast this to that psychologically dependent overall relationship which Canada has to the US. Leadership reveals culture. Canadian leaders, whether it was Justin Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney, when pressured, they speak of partnership with the US, shared values, the importance of stability. And they have to do so because of their dependence on the United States, but also because decades of that overwhelmingly close relationship that they've given up on all other options. Remember, the Canadians even arrested Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of Huawei's owner, in 2018 and kept her in prison for 4 years, which was basically done on the request of the Americans.
We were always there, standing with you.
Each one of these relationships would be maintained and you would optimize them.
By contrast, Indian leaders, whether it's Modi, Jaishankar, or Indian opposition leaders, they all speak of multipolarity. They speak of sovereignty. They speak of independence.
We have important strategic relationships with a number of countries. In the nature of global politics or global strategy today, that each one of these relationships would be maintained and you would optimize them.
Jaishankar has said it plainly. India will do what is in India's interest, period. Now, that is not the language of a country that bends. And it's not just the leaders. Public opinion mirrors it. Indian surveys just done on US favorability saw their biggest drop in decades. Which politician can go against that? Indian politics leans into emphasizing sovereignty. And that's why Modi had to make his speech in front of his BJP supporters that I may pay a price for the US, but I will not back out from protecting India's interests. Having said that, Modi has succumbed to the US much more than any other Indian leader would have done so in the past. And the Canadian leaders have stood up more now than they've ever done, as they also reconsider their approach and turn inwards for creating strength for a future relationships with the United States. But overall, the way India sees it, it is the future. It has the demographics in its favor, with over 1.4 billion people, the world's youngest workforce, English-speaking workforce, part of the information technology and services era, the fastest-growing digital economy. Expanding its manufacturing base, it has everything that the United States wants in a strategic partner in Asia to act as a countervail to China. The way India sees it, the US is losing out on the bigger picture that it should work with India as an equal and not as a subjugated servile country that is dependent on pleasing its master. Canada, by contrast, is a clear junior partner in America's framework. India can, however, position itself as that voice of the global South at BRICS, SCO, and G20. India pushes a narrative that does not begin in Washington and does not end in Washington necessarily. Whereas Canada represents America abroad, India represents itself. So when Howard Lutnick says that India will come back to the table like Canada, he misses a big point. If he, Peter Navarro, Scott Bessent all think this way, the next 4 years will see them pushing back relations with India a decade or more. However, having said all that, there is one reason Lutnick might not be totally wrong. India's rise depends on global markets, foreign capital, and technology access. If Washington decides to lock those doors, Delhi may be forced, pragmatically if not willingly, to align more closely with the US. History shows that India can resist, but it also knows when to compromise, as it did during the Cold War and in its trade disputes with the West in the past. Even now, India's not jumped to the other side, despite all the humiliations from the US. Yes, it went to the SCO summit, but it made sure not to attend China's military parade, or the online BRICS trade summit that just happened, which was attended by Jaishankar instead. Brazil's President Lula da Silva called this online gathering specially to discuss the trade tariffs imposed by the Trump administration, which you would have thought should have been very important for Prime Minister Modi to actually be present. In fact, during the meeting, the External Affairs Minister Jaishankar complained that some of our biggest trade deficits are with BRICS members. Now, the US President Donald Trump hates BRICS, and he's repeatedly threatened to impose additional tariffs on any country aligning itself with the group's anti-American policies. Or maybe India got worried after Trump's post where he wrote, "Looks like we've lost India and Russia to the deepest, darkest China. May they have a long and prosperous future together." Or India didn't want to upset the US after Trump's softer comments just this Friday, when Trump said to his reporters,
"He's great, Prime Minister. He's great. I'll always be friends, but I just don't like what he's doing at this particular moment. But India and the United States have a special relationship."
Prime Minister Modi was quick to take the win, and he posted, "Deeply appreciate and fully reciprocate President Trump's sentiments and positive assessment of our ties." Yes, India wants to show the US it has options, but it doesn't want to close the US doors. Remember, India wants to optimize all its relationships. But New Delhi may find that its balancing act has limits. To hedge against China, India may lean further towards Washington's camp, even if it never does so as submissively as Canada, but more submissively than it has done in its own past. In that sense, Lutnick's prediction isn't impossible, but it could come from strategy, if not necessarily surrender. India isn't Canada, but in a multipolar world, even sovereign nations sometimes make choices that look from the outside as if they're compromise. Thank you for watching me. Do share with me your thoughts, whether you see the Indians compromising or not going forward. I'm Najma Minhas with GVS Deep Dive. Have a great day.